One of the classes that you're teaching here at NYFA is story generation. Are there proven strategies that help writers come up with ideas?
One thing I encourage, that we were just talking a moment ago about breaking down other stories. You watch a film, figure out how they put it together. Story generation, I think so much of this is, I will try to ask a lot of questions that aren't necessarily about film or TV. What music do you like? What books have you read? We even do in that class something that's really quite fun. We do a field trip to one of the museums, either LACMA or Broad, or the Getty. And this idea of allowing yourself to be open to inspiration. During the first class, I even have this list I found somewhere online of movies that you can't imagine were made out of different material. So it wasn't a great film, sorry, but the Emoji Movie. Right, what is that? It's a symbol on a phone. They made a movie out of that. But sometimes it could be really inspired. Mean Girls, which was an adaptation Tina Fey did of, I think it's called Queen Bees and Wannabes, which is a nonfiction guide for, I think it's mostly for mothers raising teenage girls. And it's a very good read, by the way, the original manual. But what Tina Fey was able to do was, how do you keep the sort of emotion of that, the real worldness of that, and then find a fictional story, fictional characters to inhabit that space. And so I think a big part of story generation is ideas can come from so many places. Go to a coffee shop and just listen. Don't eavesdrop, don't be creepy or weird. And trust me, I warned them of that. As I told them, I'm not bailing you all out of jail, but just look around. LA is an incredibly funky place, just like New York City. I once saw someone driving a harp in the middle of New York City. And the funniest part was how few of us actually reacted. It's like, oh yeah, it's someone riding a harp. Because it's New York, and why not? Or seeing two Santa Clauses get into a fist fight, during SantaCon or one of those back in the day. So I think part of this is eyes open, allow yourself to see things around you, but then also go back a step. Think even when you were young, what inspired you? What was it that made you want to create? And sometimes it was just, you got the big box of Crayola and that was enough. It's like, wow, I have all these tools now I can use. But then also too, there's almost like a purity to story generation. I try not to be too mechanical about it, because I think what we really want students to do, and that's a first semester class, is really just allow lots of possibilities to come to the surface. So right now, that class specifically is looking at news articles, and trying to find true stories. And I always say, it doesn't have to be front page. It doesn't have to be about the things we're dealing with right now this week. You could find a human interest story from 3 years ago. Heck, you could find one of those, viral videos about a puppy being reunited with its owners. And there's a whole story there potentially. It might remind you of your own dog, right? The first time you met a puppy that became your family's dog. That right there, there's emotion already attached. There's real worldness, there's humans. And I think that's the thing that can really help someone with creation, is kind of asking yourself, well, what beyond movies and TV shows, what does make you creative? What makes you want to create things, try things, work on your voice? And so the hope is, by giving them a lot of different exercises like that, including, by the way, fables, folk tales, legends. I grew up in Delaware, as we were talking, and the camp story, I remember saying that there was a human hand at the bottom of the pool. Now, when I was 7, I believed that. I don't believe it so much at my age now, but I remember me and my friends then coming up with a whole theory of what happened to the guy. Why was the hand down there? Whose hand was it? And from that, we had a whole story, And of course, it got worse and worse over the years when we go back to camp. It wasn't just one hand, it was many hands. But that's story generation right there. That's things we did when we were little kids. It wasn't just about, you have a homework assignment. We're always coming up with something.
What tools do you give writers to help them generate ideas?
So one thing we'll talk about in story generation is the difference of a premise and a story. So I think that right there is one part of the toolkit. It's like, okay, you might think of a vampire looking for a job. Like, okay, that could be like a fun episode of What We Do in the Shadows, I suppose. And there's a number of vampire comedies, but one sentence a story does not make. So then one of the tools we'll work on is like asking questions. Well, why does a vampire need a job? It's like, what happened to their money? Like, if they've been around a long time, like the families that came over from the Mayflower, like, they tend to be pretty wealthy because guess what? They were able to get a lot of acreage of land pretty cheap at the time. And provided the family didn't mess it up along the way, well, they tend to do okay. And so we'll ask questions. Why? Why do they need a job, okay? What kind of job would be the hardest for them to do? If you're doing a comedy, that's kind of a fun place to go. Who else is in their orbit? What are their relationships? So a really good tool is, ask questions of your own idea. It's almost like being a little kid, to go back to that metaphor. Well, why? Why'd you do that, Dad? Like, what happened? Well, then what? It's like especially when you just want a little peace and quiet, those are the questions you get asked by really young kids. But it's not a bad way to approach a story. Ask a lot of questions of it. Ask questions of your character. Let's say you go to the Broad and you see an interesting piece of art. Well, then ask yourself the question, well, if there's a person in a painting, like, well, what were they doing a moment before? It's a question I would always ask actors when I directed plays. It's like if someone comes into a scene, where are you coming from? What were you just doing? Which sounds really obvious, but sometimes when you're acting, you forget that. Or when you're writing, you forget about the moment before the moment. And so I think like those kind of questions can really help give an idea or a premise legs, meaning like a movement, so it can be a story. So there can be an act two, there can be obstacles and complications. Because without those questions, it might just stay a concept, an idea, a singular image, as opposed to back in the day, 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second that we have with video, And I think like those very basic questions oftentimes is a tool that it's easy to sort of forget about, but important to use. Because if you ask questions, then it means you have to come up with answers.
And if maybe the curiosity is not there, maybe that's testing it that you're not sure you even want to stay with the story for that long.
Right. It's a great point. Like if you're not finding the answers, maybe they aren't answers, right? So then it's like, okay, well, maybe then it is like, okay, maybe this is not the painting that's going to give you this story. Keep walking. When we do the field trip, which is such a fun day. It's one of those, we always joke, it makes us all feel like we're young, because we just walk around the museum and just try to take things in. But then you go to another piece. Maybe that's the thing that you'll be able to answer those questions.
Beyond key questions for generating ideas, are there any other tools for idea generation for stories?
I think always have something with you to record. That's something that, we have cell phones. Prior to cell phones, it would be little notebooks, right? But the idea of you see something, don't let the idea disappear. We're kind of all like goldfish, we swim around, we forget. So I think part of this is okay, you might be out and about and you see an interaction between two people and it gets you thinking. So write things down, record things, take pictures, but don't be weird, right? Don't be stalky, but keep track of those things. That class specifically, do a lot of exercises in class, but then I tell them all, keep everything. It's to use Arrested Development, the great Carl Weathers had the joke about, you can make a stew. Everything can be used to make a stew. Well, that's kind of ideation. I had in high school, a girl said something to me, one sentence, that inspired a script a bunch of years later. And it wasn't so much about what she said, it was about what I said back. And I had a script later about, well, what if I said the exact opposite thing? And a story came out of that, And so part of this is trying to remember things is hard. Writing down things isn't so hard. And I didn't write in high school at all. So For me, it was, I'm not even sure how I got there, how I remembered that moment. But I think like, we have so many ways of capturing things now. If you're bopping around on Instagram or X or wherever else people are going nowadays in social media, like screen grab things, like, have a little folder of photos that could potentially be, part of your well of ideas, part of your arsenal of material.
It sounds like whatever that comment was, it meant something to you, whether it was negative or positive. You held on to it.
Yeah. Well, and it was like an important moment. It was, kind of went through something as a high schooler, and this was me kind of coming out of that. And then something said, I was like, whoa, that's unexpected. So, enough that I remembered it later, and I know sometimes writers will just go and take their diary and change names, which is not a bad angle to take, but it might limit you, if you're just working off your own diary. And not to mention our real lives, sometimes they're hard to turn into stories because life doesn't necessarily move in a 3-act kind of way. It's why even like great stories based on true stories often have to change things, because it would be a 7-hour movie with a lot of dead time. It's why when they did, Chernobyl, the miniseries, they had to basically take like 10 characters and combine them into one character that I believe was played by Samantha Morton. And she's wonderful in it, and it's a really, really good limited series. It's incredible, won the Emmy for a reason. But they needed to do that because in the real world, it would have been 10 different scientists, which would have taken away some of the drama of having one character that we track.